Night Vision. Following clues left by our ancestors, we unbury the past to reveal a knowledge of unfathomable value, putting us just a little closer to our own true birthrights. From the secret history of a possible bloodline of Jesus Christ, the secret history of America's founders, to the secret history of extraterrestrial interaction on our planet, here to bring light to the night. Your host for Night Vision Radio, Renee Barnett.
Hey everybody, how are you? How was your week? It seems like it's just passed by so quickly this past week. Seems like I was just sitting here speaking with you, but I'm so glad to be back, especially with the show that we have planned for this evening. It's really, really an eye-opener. We're going to be talking tonight about the Patty Hearst kidnapping, and just before we went on the air, I was talking to my guest, and he was saying, Patty Hearst was sort of like the least part of the story, but it was the part that captured the attention of the worldwide press at the time. So as we usually do here on Night Vision, we'll start out with just a little bit of information that was out in the public purview and remains so to this day. Now, this is the public story. And again, we're going back to our good old friend Wikipedia. And this is not verbatim, but this is drawn from information gleaned from Wikipedia. All right. Patricia Campbell Hearst, granddaughter of American publishing magnate William Randolph Hearst, became internationally known for events following her 1974 kidnapping by the left-wing organization Symbionese Liberation Army. She was arrested 19 months later, by which time she was a fugitive and wanted for serious crimes committed with the members of the group. At her trial, the prosecution suggested that Hearst had joined the SLA of her own volition, but she testified that she had been raped and threatened with death while held captive. In 1976, she was convicted for the crime of bank robbery and sentenced to 35 years in prison. That was later reduced to just 7 years, and her sentence was commuted by President Jimmy Carter, and she was pardoned by President Bill Clinton. Another one of those pardons going out there. But I think maybe I might understand why, but not for the reasons that other people might assume from what's out there in public information. But my guest tonight has done an amazing body of work on a book that he has written called Revolution's End, The Patty Hearst Kidnapping, Mind Control, and the Secret History of Donald DeFreeze and the SLA. And that last line right there, the secret history of Donald DeFreeze and the SLA, that's kind of the biggest part. So we're going to jump right into it with my guest tonight, award-winning journalist and author and producer and writer and so much more, Brad Schrieber. Hey, Brad, how are you?
It's great to be on with you, Renee. Thank you very much.
Oh, I'm so happy to have you. I mean, this, it's a little bit jaw-dropping, what you're alleging in your book. But I have to say, it does seem to be backed up by quite a lot of evidence and extensive research. Would you share with me, or with us, rather, I should say, how you got into this story and the story about the cache of research that you came upon and managed to get your hands on?
Sure. Well, I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area when Patty Hearst was kidnapped. Not only that, I went to Burlingame High School. The next town was Hillsborough, where she had grown up. So this was a big deal. I actually got into the Patty Hearst trial one day, and in reading about it in the alternative press, such as the Berkeley Barb and the LA Free Press, and radio programs, stuff from Paul Krasner and Mae Brussel, I began to understand that Donald DeFreeze was an informant. He had drugs used on him in prison, and he was allowed to escape and create a supposed left-wing group that his white followers never knew about. And we can talk a little bit later about why Patty Hearst was involved at all with this police action. I had a lot of... Just to finish with that, Renee, I had a lot of stuff that I had researched on my own. But before I wrote Revolution's End, I found there was a guy named Dick Russell who had written an article in 1976 called Who Ran the SLA? And it was the final part of my research that I had been missing. It talked about the creation of the SLA, other black convicts who were offered the opportunity to run the SLA. And when I got my research off of him, I said, I'm the only person who has the complete story. I've got to write this book.
Wow. Oh, that's amazing. Now, I know that sort of one of the things that the prosecution at the time was alleging was that this was a crime of opportunity because Patty Hearst lived sort of nearby the SLA headquarters. And so they were trying to sort of angle it that way. But I know that you discovered that there was a lot more to the reasons behind, besides being, close to the neighborhood. But when you did meet Dick Russell, right?
Absolutely. And when we met and he said, I will sell you my research, I said, well, can I look at it first? And he said, yes. And he had a folder about 3 inches thick, smelled nice and musty, from 1976 when he wrote that Argosy magazine article. And within 30 seconds, Renee, I knew I had to buy it. It had unredacted prison reports. It had information about DeFries being an informant for the state of California, as well as for the prisons. It had documentation that probably didn't exist anywhere because it had probably already been destroyed. And so that's when I made the commitment to get the research from him, and then write about Revolution's End, which ironically came out the same day as the book from Jeffrey Toobin about Patty Hearst, which is filled with inaccuracies.
Well, I mean, it also sort of toes the company line, doesn't it? I mean, there was really nothing in there that we hadn't already kind of heard, or certainly nothing like what you're setting out in your book. Nothing really controversial, at least from my memory. It's been a couple years now since that book came out, and then, of course, he's now thoroughly embarrassed himself in a Zoom meeting, so we won't see him around for a little while. He'll be taking a little vacation, a little mental health break. But
yeah, you're absolutely right about that. It's if your listeners understand that even if you do excellent research, if you go to New York, which is the center of the publishing industry in this country, and you say, here's my documentation, Donald DeFries, CIA victim of mind control, used to create a phony left-wing group, had a secret love affair with Patty Hearst and 2 other white women who are also in the SLA, the first thing they think of is, oh my God, we're going up against the United States government. We're condemning the United States government, and we expect to publish this? So that's why Toobin's book didn't touch at all on some of these issues about the FBI, the CIA, and the prisons. There was a lot of corruption under Ronald Reagan's prisons in the 60s.
Yeah, let's go back, because you've thrown out a lot of allegations there, and things, and each one of them is sort of a blockbuster. So can we sort of just start back before the kidnapping happened? Now you say in your book that there was actually a romantic or at least a physical relationship between Patty Hearst and Donald DeFries, the infamous Sin-Q, before the whole thing happened, that they already knew each other.
Well, let me correct you. The place to start with is December of 1967, when Donald DeFries, who's starving to death in South Central Los Angeles, has been tricked into a marriage, has 6 kids and a wife that he can't keep fed, steals guns to supplement his living, and is caught by the LAPD. And one of the few ranking black officers in the LAPD, Detective Ronald Farwell, says to DeFries, "I know you had a partner." And to his amazement, DeFries, who doesn't want to go to jail, says, I'll take you to the guy who worked with me, and he's got a cache of drugs and guns in his apartment if you'll let me off. And because he did that, DeFries set himself on a road to become an informant. And for a while, he then served the LAPD. When he became so incompetent they couldn't trust him anymore, they threw him into the California Medical Facility at Vacaville. And that's where he, along with other black prisoners, had drugs illicitly used on them to see how far they could push them psychologically and to use them as snitches within the prison system, okay? Now, I know this is not about Patty yet, but you have to understand.
No, I don't care.
What led up to it.
I don't care.
Up to it.
Let's
and
hear
what people
yeah.
don't understand about, that time in California is Ronald Reagan, as governor, was so law and order, he was terrified because the Black Panthers had been founded in Oakland in 1966. There were Chicano groups and white groups against the war in Vietnam, and there was a very powerful militant black prisoner movement because they were given insane sentences. George Jackson, who wrote a couple of books and was a cause celeb as a prisoner, had been thrown in jail for being at a gas station holdup where no one was injured, and he was given 5 years to life. Wow. So you can see why this militancy built up, especially among the black prisoners. And then you, of course, have the CIA running an experiment with the cooperation of the prisons. And that's how Donald DeFries once again became a snitch. He said, "Please don't use these drugs on me. I'll do anything you want." And he was the only black prisoner they could get who was willing to set up the Symbionese Liberation Army. And that was done in conjunction with a black CIA officer named Colston Westbrook, who's the most fascinating character in Revolution's End. So maybe we'll stop there and see where you want to go.
Ooh. Well, now, you said that Donald DeFries said, please don't give me those drugs. So obviously these guys knew they were being drugged and experimented on.
Yep.
And so if he didn't get the drugs, then where did the mind control come in?
No, he let me correct you. He had drugs used on him along with many other black prisoners, including a guy named Clifford Jefferson. And interestingly, this connects to Leo Ryan, who was the representative Congressman who was killed in Jonestown, knew about this. He was a real advocate for prison reform, and he actually got a confirmation letter from the CIA that said, yes, we were using certain experimentation methods on black prisoners in Vacaville. They signed informed consent releases. Well, of course, if you're a prisoner during this time, and they say we're going to use drugs on you, and you have to basically sign this form allowing us to, if you said no, oftentimes in the system you were either thrown into solitary confinement or they got another gang member to kill you. This is literally on the record. The California prisons under Raymond Procunier, networking with Governor Ronald Reagan, would threaten the lives of prisoners if they didn't submit to drug testing or snitching on other prisoners. That's how volatile the political situation was among black prisoners in California prisons and especially in the Bay Area.
Wow. So what kind of drugs were they giving them?
Yeah. I was amazed to find that there was a drug that was called Prolixin that was used on Donald DeFries. There might have been others as well. Prolixin was injected into the prisoner and made him so antsy that he couldn't sleep, he couldn't relax, but always felt exhausted. And the drug, after injected, lasted 2 weeks in the system. So it drove these guys to near insanity.
Sleep deprivation.
And utter exhaustion.
Oh, gosh. So how did the whole Patty Hearst thing come into play?
Okay, so let's go back to Colston Westbrook. He's the former CIA agent who was in Vietnam during the Phoenix program, the CIA's horrific program where they murdered between 25 and 40,000 citizens who they suspected of being Viet Cong and had no proof. So Colston Westbrook is an expert in interrogation techniques, and Ronald Reagan's head of counterintelligence, a guy named William Herman, Herrmann, was also in Vietnam. So Reagan and Ethel Younger, the Attorney General, want to infiltrate the black prisoner movement and also stop the Panthers and the anti-war protesters. And Herman says, you need to use this guy that I know, Colston Westbrook. He's brilliant, and he can set up a program within the prisons that seems like it's a chance for leftist white people on the outside to talk with black prisoners on the inside. But what we'll be doing is gaining intelligence on those people in the Bay Area who are leftist activists, and then we can follow them. And so that program that Colston Westbrook set up in Vacaville brought in certain white radicals, amongst whom was Patty Hearst, Nancy Ling Perry, and Patricia Soltysik. Those two women who I mentioned at the end became members of the SLA. They thought that DeFries was going to break out of prison. Instead of being allowed to leave prison, they didn't know he was a police agent, and he set up this radical organization which then was going to behave irresponsibly and destroy the power of the left wing, which exactly is what it did.
Wow. Now, who exactly... So was it Westbrook that was responsible for the setting up or instrumental in setting up the SLA?
Absolutely. It was even his name. He came up with the title, using symbiosis, a mutually beneficial relationship between two different systems, Symbionese Liberation Army. DeFries was a snitch while this was going on, and he was allowed to deal marijuana. Oh, here's another thing that 95% of the public doesn't know. Under Reagan, this system to sort of get snitches within the prisons, those black prisoners who cooperated with the prison guards and the heads of prisons were allowed to deal drugs in the prisons. And DeFries was one of those people. And I said he dealt marijuana, but sometimes they allowed them to do anything from marijuana to LSD to heroin, because that's how much they wanted to break up the cells within the prisons that were communicating with the Panthers on the outside and so forth. So you got Patty, Nancy Ling Perry, and Patricia Soltysik, who are attending these meetings of what's called the Black Cultural Association. And that's Colston Westbrook's manipulation. Let's have this phony group where black prisoners and white radicals talk, and we'll have all the names of the people that come in. It'll be our intelligence gathering. So that's why it was set up.
So if they were, trying to interrupt whatever it was that, they perceived the left wing was doing, then what was the rationale behind the murder of the Oakland school superintendent?
Right. So what happened was Oakland, which was historically 40 to 50% black in the school system, never had a black school superintendent. Dr. Marcus Foster came out of Philadelphia, which, by the way, was a lot rougher system. Kids were killed in the schools in Philadelphia, and rarely had there been that level of violence in Oakland. So when he was elected, the thing that doomed him is the Black Panthers went to Marcus Foster and said, we think that basically this is a racist country and a racist city, and we want to network with you and have more input into the schools. Well, that is the last thing that Ronald Reagan and Ethel Younger wanted, was in Oakland, the home of the Black Panthers, the Panthers would start having any relationship with a school superintendent. So when DeFreeze got his get-out-of-jail-free card, they said, you're going to form this group, and then inevitably he was told, your first action is to try and find someone to assassinate Marcus Foster. And the rationale for doing so is that he's going to start putting police into Oakland schools. That was a lie. But even though, and this has been documented by KQED Television and the San Francisco Chronicle, even though when DeFreeze was out and trying to find leftists to kill Marcus Foster, they all thought he was a police agent. Their attitude was, finally, there's a black superintendent in an almost 50% black school district. Why would we want to kill that guy? We don't know anything about police being put in schools. So when that failed, DeFreeze's orders were, okay, you and your white followers who don't know that you're an agent, you have to kill Marcus Foster. And hopefully it will create an insurrection in the Bay Area and create a context for the police and the FBI to start sweeping up and arresting people.
That makes sense. But backing up to when he was in prison, Donald DeFreeze, he was allowed to sell drugs along with other people, you said, but he was also allowed some other perks in prison, like conjugal visits.
That's right. Conjugal trailers were set up at Vacaville, and then later he was transferred to Soledad. And only married prisoners who behaved were allowed to have visits from their wives, for sex. And they were very brief, and it was sort of a reward for good behavior. So here was Donald DeFreeze, who was completely out of touch with his wife, and he was being allowed to sleep with these white radical women who went to the BCA meetings that Colston Westbrook had set up. And he was having sex with Soltysik, Nancy Ling Perry, and also Patty Hearst. Patty Hearst was about to be married. She thought, this is a last fling with radical black prisoner before I get married.
Wow.
She had no idea. She had no idea what she was getting into. And neither did the other women, neither did the followers. And by the way, your listeners may not be aware that in 1974 they caught up with DeFreeze and 5 followers, and they had 500 police surround a house in south central Los Angeles, pour 5,000 bullets into it, and eventually use incendiary devices to burn the house to the ground in the middle of the south central ghetto. And it was on live television.
I saw it on TV.
For all 3 networks, live for 2 hours. And it was an incredibly powerful message to the left in California and, of course, the rest of the country that, if you protest, this is what you get.
But what you assert is that, they purposely set the place on fire and let it burn.
Actually, I did a lot of research in writing Revolution's End, but I found this out. And the way I found it out was the LA Times coverage said that something called a Federal 555 tear gas grenade was thrown into that little house. By the way, there were 75 tear gas projectiles shot into that tiny house. Well, I did my research and I looked it up. The Federal 555 is an incendiary grenade, not for indoor use. It's for outdoor riot control. It's highly combustible. But the shootout had been going on for an hour, and the mostly white police force in an almost completely black neighborhood said, "We do not want to be here after nightfall." And nobody had the guts to report it, but the tactical decision to burn down the house was based on the fact that if they didn't get the people to surrender, they felt that under cover of night, that black citizens, seeing a white police force pour all of this firepower into a house, would start firing on the police. And so they decided to burn it to the ground, and the head of the company that manufactured the Federal 555 was so terrified when he was interviewed for the LA Times that he both said, yes, it is for outdoor use, and then quickly added, but the police didn't do anything wrong. The last thing the head of that company wanted was to say that the LAPD illegally used his product and burned these people to the ground because they didn't want any of them to come out alive. And in fact, the LAPD wanted to get out of that part of town as fast as possible.
That is
never published before until my book.
Yes, I know. It's like I'm certainly old enough to remember when all this was going on. In fact, I was a young, very, very young, I think I was like 8 years old. No, just kidding. News reporter at the time at a rock and roll AM radio station in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Right. And so the news, of course, that I was getting was coming across the AP and UPI wires and the Reuters wires. I mean, they were actually paper, things being fed out, and every hour I would go and rip them off and, rewrite them and, give my newscasts. So what the news that I was giving out was just what was out there, is just basically what we were all being told.
Yes,
so,
well, just think of all the years that have passed, Renee.
Yeah, a lot.
The documentary on PBS called Gorilla, I met that director, and I brought up to him in a Q&A after the movie, what did you find out in your research about Colston Westbrook? And he said, I wasn't interested. And I said, well, in front of a crowd of people in a Hollywood movie theater, I said, why wouldn't you be interested in a CIA officer creating the SLA and running Donald DeFreeze? And you heard a buzz go through the crowd, and the moderator said, we don't have time for that question. Let's move on.
Oh, my gosh.
Societally, this is why I wrote the book. I was sick and tired of people like Jeffrey Toobin and the guy who did Gorilla, who, by the way, won an Emmy Award and didn't tell you any of the things I'm telling you. I was sick and tired of people not getting how vindictive, how illegal Ronald Reagan was in terms of law and order, and how Donald DeFreeze basically, while I'm not forgiving him for everything he didn't have a chance in life. He became an informant for the LAPD just to survive. And by the way, at the time of the FBI's COINTELPRO in like 68, when they were having a black nationalist program, they had 3,500 informants, black informants operating around the country. By the time they finished, there were about 7,500 in 1971. So God. That gives you these are documented numbers, and just to give you a sense of it, in 1969 there were 67 informants inside the Black Panther Party chapters around the country. That's how invaded the movements were, and it's not surprising with Ronald Reagan as governor of California and Richard Nixon as president.
Oh, my goodness gracious. This might be a good time to remind our audience that you are listening to Night Vision on KGRAradio.com. I'm Renee Barnett, your host, and we are talking with my good friend and a fabulous author and journalist, award-winning, actually, Brad Schrieber. We're talking about sort of the Patty Hearst kidnapping incident. That's our sort of doorway into this story. But there's really, really so much more than just that one incident. So much more. It goes very, very deep. Now, when you started researching this, you were already looking into this by the time you ran into the research?
Dick Russell.
Yeah, that you ran into Dick Russell and obtained his research. You were already onto this story. Is that right?
Yeah. The easiest way, Renee, to explain this is everything in Revolution's End I basically already knew on my own, except for the fact that there was a black prisoner named Robert Hyde, who was a jailhouse lawyer, and he was offered the role of running the SLA before Donald DeFreeze, and he refused, and they threw him into solitary confinement. So then he agreed to work with the prisons to inform in case he heard anything. But DeFreeze was the only black prisoner they could get because he had already been an informant for the LAPD. And he figured, I'll take my chances on the outside, not knowing that he was going to be expected to kill Marcus Foster, that inevitably, he should have seen the writing on the wall, that inevitably they would basically say, oh, DeFreeze created the SLA, and he's a murderer, and we have to take him out. So basically, he was a police agent who then was betrayed by his controllers and went, well, the hell with it. If you're coming after me, I'm going to be a revolutionary. And part of that revolution was kind of an ingenious thing, which is instead of asking for ransom money for Patty Hearst, who he was angry with because she had rejected him after a while, instead of asking for ransom money, he went to Randolph Hearst in Hillsborough and said, I want you to fund a program to give free food to the poorest people in California. It was called the People in Need Program. And that's exactly what happened. And all of a sudden, everybody forgot that the SLA had killed Marcus Foster, and the left thought, wow, these guys are really great.
They're feeding
really
the people.
Helping support. Yeah.
Now, I know that they had asked for an amount of money to be distributed to people. I think it was like $70 a person or something that would have come out to like $400 million or something. And instead...
No, it wasn't that much, Renee. They didn't offer to give money to the people. They offered groceries that were about
No. I think
$70 in value.
This may be completely wrong, but they said that they were, well, maybe it was groceries in the amount of $70 per person. Yeah. That's what they were asking. And, of course, that would have been tons of money. And so instead, it was said that her father took out a loan and gave a couple $1 million or something to feed people in the San Francisco Bay Area.
No. Let me stop you. It wasn't just San Francisco. It was Los Angeles. It came to about $2 million. It wasn't a loan. But when DeFreeze said, well, we want more money.
More misinformation out there then, because that's what's out there. I just read that about 15 minutes ago. But But my point is that in what I read, and this may be completely wrong also, but they said something about that and I don't recall this exactly from the book or from real life at the time because it's been so long ago, but that somehow that food program distribution fell into chaos or something. What happened with that? What did they mean by that?
Well, at first there was not enough security at these events. There was robbery of food. It was chaotic. But as the program went on, they inevitably had it better managed, and it did give away food to the poorest people in Northern and Southern California. But DeFreeze still didn't basically Well, basically, Patty Hearst was a radical who was having sex with a black prisoner who didn't know that he was going to kidnap her and make her into a revolutionary. But what people don't understand is Patty Hearst already was far left. And so if you throw her in a closet and ostensibly give her drugs, which her attorney told me he thought was done, you give her psychedelics, threaten her, let her out of the closet at times and say, they're all going to kill all of us, you might as well join us. It's not so hard to imagine someone who's already leftist agreeing to become part of that gang. They feel they have no other choice.
So you do feel that there was pressure put upon her by the SLA or by whoever they were.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
So that
inevitably
otherwise
she became one of them. And that's why she didn't run away, because she embraced their politics. She turned against her family. She loved her father, but she hated her mother, who was a friend of Reagan's and actually on the Board of Regents for the university system. And so her father, she was daddy's girl, but her mother was a Republican. And so she was always kind of rebellious. She was the one in the family who was most rebellious. And it's not so amazing to think that she was converted, in essence.
Well, I mean, there were a lot of prominent young white people back in the day. I mean, I the first one that comes to mind was Candace Bergen. She was very much involved with the Panthers. And I was going to say,
there were a lot of white celebrities who supported the black. Leonard Bernstein was a huge supporter of the Black Panthers. So, it cut across all areas of, sort of white, upper class, show business personalities.
I mean, was it kind of a thing? It kind of seems like, to me, in a way, it was kind of like almost trendy, at the time to be, a rich white radical, for some reason.
A lot of it's true that a lot of the white leftists were from middle or upper middle class families, but they weren't phony. They were seeing the war in Vietnam, killing people. They saw how racist America was. They saw the inequality and the suffering of people, and they legitimately said we need to do something about it. And the Black Panthers 10-point system, when they founded in 1966, was extremely reasonable. It asked for, schools and job opportunities. There were a couple of points that you probably couldn't get today. They asked for reparations, which is something we talk about today for Black Americans. Mm-hmm. They asked for mandated all black juries for black crimes in the inner city. And of course, they never would have gotten that. But everything else they asked for was basically what anybody would expect in white America. And of course, the infiltration of the FBI into the Black Panthers created a West Coast, East Coast war, and they became more militant. There was drug dealing, there was violence, and a basically decent and deserving organization collapsed.
So involved in this, in terms of government agencies, were the LAPD, the California Corrections,
California
FBI,
Department of Corrections,
FBI, and the CIA.
That's right. LAPD, by the way, at Parker Center, which is no more the headquarters of the LAPD, their intelligence gathering was so powerful that they had CIA and FBI agents visiting Parker Center and liaising with their contacts.
Wow.
The guy, Ronald Farwell, I mentioned, who basically ran DeFreeze as an informant, he had him trying to sell weapons to supposed Black Panthers in Watts and South Central. that organization didn't pay informants enough money to live on. So that's why DeFreeze would have to go and try and find other jobs. That group within the LAPD was called the Criminal Conspiracy Section. And they were extremely influential. And not only that, DeFreeze was working for what was called the CII, which was the equivalent of the FBI for the state of California. And it's a highly convoluted book, I admit, but if you read Revolution's End, you'll read that Donald DeFreeze at one point, before he founded the SLA, was trying to set up Black Panthers on the East Coast. So he was one of these guys who was seen as potentially being very useful because he'd already been an LAPD informant, and he seemed very willing to do whatever was necessary to betray his own people, as well as any other people who were leftist.
So basically, the Panthers at the time was a legitimate group of people, whether you agree with them or not, working towards specific goals. But the SLA was never real. But some of the people inside the SLA were real, and they were thinking that they were working for the people or for some ideal. Is that correct?
That's right. Everyone who followed them, and there were never more than, say, 10 members at any given time before the 1974 shootout and fire. They were all white. They were all pretty well educated, and they all kowtowed to Donald DeFreeze because they felt white guilt. You know, here's a black escaped prisoner who to them was like a rock star, and he was trying to effect change. Now, there was pushback when DeFreeze said we're going to have to kill Marcus Foster in Oakland, but he just said, no, we have to do it. There are police infiltrating Oakland schools. It was a lie, and inevitably the group went along with it. But those people weren't inherently violent until DeFreeze led them into violence. And then, of course, it destroyed the credibility of a lot of other leftist groups in the Bay Area who were nonviolent but opposed to Reagan and Nixon. And that's, in a way, one of the most devastating effects of the creation of the SLA, is that it stopped the new left movement in the United States.
I got a question from the chat room for you, if you don't mind, Brad.
Sure.
It's a good one. Blue Orb asks, is the current Antifa versus neo-Nazis a continuation of this type of action? Now, I'm reading that as, are these, possibly set up organizations created to wreak havoc or something like that? That's how I read it. I don't know if that's Blue Orb's intention of the question, but I'll let you interpret it the way you want. Is the current situation a continuation of this type of action?
Let me put it this way, and I hope that Blue Orb, I'm getting your intent. Antifa is a legitimate anti-fascist organization. However, I can tell you from my research that a lot of what was going on in Portland was white supremacist stuff. I don't know if they were being run by law enforcement or they were just white supremacists who were acting on their own, but they were called Antifa and they weren't. So the problem is it gets very murky, because
how do you know?
Well, exactly.
How do we even know what we're looking at?
Right, and under somebody like Trump, who lies consistently, to tell your followers that somebody is Antifa when in fact they're white supremacists who are trying to, mess up the situation, it's very hard to sort that out.
Well, not only that, but, when we just see it on the news and there are just people out there fighting and everything, it's hard to sort of sort them out. Some of them are in uniform, but with no insignias. Some of them, are just in street clothes. So it's like, just to the average person looking at everything and trying to sort everything out. And then we have all these this news and conspiracy theories coming at us, it's no wonder that people get confused, or people just don't know, what's what these days, because it's like down is up. And, the opposite is true of everything that you look at almost.
Yeah, that's where you have to do critical thinking, and you have to do research. Most of the stuff that I found for this book, I didn't have to go to like special archives and fly around the country and so forth. I'd say 80% of my research I found on the internet. But you've got to be willing to look, and you have to know how to look in the right place. And you've got to have sources. And you don't repeat stuff that you'd like to be true but isn't true. And as a matter of fact, Revolutions End won 2 book awards. One from the International Book Awards at Book Expo in New York, and one from the Independent Publishers Book Awards. And my agent said to me, well, when you publish this book, they're going to sue you. And I said, no, they're not. First of all, I don't have the money. And secondly, it's all backed up. Nobody sued me. This thing was bulletproof.
Wow.
Everything is backed up in here. I didn't receive one letter, one threat from the FBI, the LAPD, the CIA, the prisons about, we disagree with you, or we're going to bring some legal action, because it was well researched. The problem is you can't afford to go on a website that doesn't give you citations, that doesn't tell you its sources, and then start repeating it.
That's true.
It may well be that there's a just cause, but we need to be more critical, and we need to ask people their sources. There's nothing wrong with it when somebody says, well, I heard this happen, and you go, oh, that's interesting. What's your source?
Exactly.
Well, I don't know. Well, then, until I know what your source is, I don't know that I believe it. You're entitled to do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, my goodness.
You've got 10 minutes left. What do you want to do now?
Well, not quite 10 minutes, because we actually end about 4 minutes before the hour. But
all right. What would you like to talk about now?
Well, I would kind of like to, if you don't mind, get into, for instance, I know that Congressman Ryan worked toward the pardon or maybe the commutation of Patty Hearst's sentence.
Yeah,
and was that based on that, any kind of pressure, political pressure, or was that because he truly felt that she had been compromised, mentally in some way?
Yes, it's the latter. It's the latter, Renee. Leo Ryan in San Mateo County, who was, my representative when I was a little boy. I actually met him when I was a little boy. Just came to the door handing out literature. He was very active in politics regarding prison reform. He found out by getting research on Vacaville that a CIA program called MK Search, which fell under the rubric of MK Ultra, everybody knows about that.
Yeah.
You see that on cable TV all the time. That MK Search was using drugs on black prisoners in Vacaville, and he found out that Donald DeFreeze, who supposedly created the SLA, was one of those people. So he wrote to the CIA and said, I want you to confirm this, and he got a letter back from Frank Carlucci, who later became the head of the CIA, and said, yes, we can confirm that there were experimentations done, and we can't tell you any more about it. So Leo Ryan leaks that to Jack Anderson, the well-respected syndicated columnist, and Anderson did a follow-up on it with the administrator of Vacaville, a guy named Lawrence Clannon, who confirmed that DeFreeze was one of those prisoners who was experimented upon. So Leo Ryan's attitude, by the time everything unfolded with the SLA and Patty Hearst, was, you can't give her 7 years because she was kidnapped against her will by a police agent, someone who was working for Ronald Reagan and the Attorney General to try and subvert left-wing organizing, and was responsible for 5 people dying under him. And, you know, when he provided all of this intel, inevitably Jimmy Carter said, I agree, and I'll make it 22 months instead of 7 years. And that was the reason. Now, I'm already working on another project, and I won't go into it too deeply, but Leo Ryan was murdered at Jonestown.
Okay, that's what I was just getting ready to bring up.
Yeah.
Now, can we draw any connections between his investigation into what you just said and his demise?
Absolutely. Joe Holsinger, who was the congressional aide for Leo Ryan in San Mateo County, knew that the CIA, there was a guy named Richard Dwyer, who was at the Guyana, he was an ambassador to Guyana, you know, he was in the embassy, but he was also a CIA officer, as is often the case in embassies. And Dwyer had a relationship with Jim Jones. And without spending a lot of time on it, Ryan said, we're going to investigate this because people in San Mateo are worried about their relatives in Jonestown. Is it safe to go? And the State Department lied to him and said, yes, there's no problem. Meanwhile, Richard Dwyer was organizing with Jim Jones and basically said to him, we've got an American congressman coming here, and you better sweet talk him, because if he investigates what's going on here, we're cutting you loose. All of our support of Jonestown and all of the drugs that were in Jonestown, we're going to put it all on you, Jim Jones. And Jim Jones basically knew it was the beginning of the end when he had Ryan killed. He knew the CIA was going to disavow their relationship with him, and then he figured, fine, I'll organize a mass quote-unquote suicide, which, by the way, was murder. It was the murder of those people. There were armed guards. Many of them were injected. Many of them were shot. Nobody knows, by the way, who killed Jim Jones to this day. So, long story short, Leo Ryan's death was because he was suckered into going into Jonestown. The State Department should have said, it's not safe. Do not go there. But basically, he was the greatest adversary to the CIA, had created legislation against the CIA. He found out what happened with Patty Hearst, and the CIA was furious about that. And in essence, they couldn't kill an American congressman on U.S. soil, so they used the excuse of a bunch of loony people in the jungle killing him.
Wow. That was another big one that played out in front of the cameras. I remember seeing, you know, that airstrip situation where he was shot, and along with others. That was unbelievable. And then, of course, the images of all those bodies lying there.
So, of course, my problem is I don't have the time or the money to independently write another deep book about this, because one has to make a living. But I feel the same way I did about Revolution's End, which is you've told us lies for 40 years, or 50 years now, actually, and I'm sick of hearing it. And I'd like to put a book out there somehow that corrects all the lies that we've been fed for half a century about the murder of Leo Ryan and what was really going on at Jonestown. I mean, I have state cables that said, you know, we found 11,000 doses of Thorazine at Jonestown. They were injecting people with drugs and controlling them just the way they controlled black prisoners in the San Francisco Bay Area. They just moved them to another place because there was too much heat on Jim Jones from the media. And that's why he went to Guyana in the first place.
Very ugly stuff.
Yeah,
ugly
well, God knows what they're doing today, but it's probably a little more secretive.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I hope you do get a chance to finish that Leo Ryan book. I would love to read that one and have you back. And in the meantime, everyone should go to Amazon and look for Revolution's End by Brad Schrieber. It's Revolution's End, the Patty Hearst kidnapping, mind control, and the secret history of Donald DeFreeze and the SLA. Good stuff. Thank you so much for being on, and I hope everybody has a great week coming up. Next week, please join me. We're going to be looking into our government's secret psychic spy program with one of those very few authentic military psychic spies, Lynn Buchanan, who's with Project Stargate and a remote viewer. And he's an amazing, amazing storyteller. So we're going to have him on next week. I hope you'll join us. Thanks so much, everybody. Good night.